Hey there, welcome to the Reinsurance Podcast, the place where we dive into all things reinsurance, the coolest part of insurance. We're your hosts, Jared and Ben, a couple of ex-practitioners who loved the industry so much we founded Supercede to tackle some of its biggest headaches. And we're here to share our insights and stories with expert guests as we uncover what's really going on in the industry. I've got Tom here with me again. Welcome back to the show.
Thank you very much. Good to be here.
Always fun.
Always. Yeah, the listeners have got a bit used to me recently.
Yeah. They're going to be spoiled for choice now with you and Ben as co-hosting options.
Yeah, I think I'll be glad to hand the reins back over to Ben.
No, it's always fun to have you in the studio. We're going to talk today about data. It's a topic we beat to death on the podcast, but it's a super important one. And the episode today, I wanted to dive into a little bit around just the sheer volume of data. There's that sort of statistic that more data gets created every 6 months or every year than has ever been created in history, and that's just getting more and more with AI generating more data and things. But the fact that everyone just wants all of it all the time, but sometimes when you ask them what they're doing with it, it's utterly unclear. But they know it's valuable because they were told 6 years ago it's the new oil. And so I want to talk about this idea of drowning in data oil, like a tiny sad duckling or something.
No, I think that's a good point. And it was really the advent and the creation of a lot of the kind of data protection legislation that we have today was actually built out of this environment where people are just collecting data for the sake of collecting data. It's very unclear what they're going to use it for or why. And governments all over the world have decided that that's unacceptable on a consumer level, right? When you collect that volume of information about people. But we see it in the world of reinsurance as well. And reinsurance companies asking for a vast amount of information, insurance companies collecting a vast amount of information. How much of it is actually used for useful things like pricing, predictive analytics, creating new models, is really variable across the industry. But there's no way it's all used.
Yeah. I think the ambition is there to figure out how best to use it, but we've struggled with, and I'm not entirely sure why we have the difficulty that we do leveraging it for things like pricing models or predictive analytics. It might be that just the complexity and the difficulty of trying to associate the data with results. It might be the sort of nuanced one-off nature of losses in our industry. You might have a lot of valuable information around consumer products and home structures and all these things, but at the end of the day, the frequency of events that cause massive property losses are so variable that it's hard to sort of have this really powerful predictive layer, knowing that can't really tell if the hurricane's going to hit these areas or not. You might be able to better predict the exposure, the loss you're having as it's happening are similar, but in terms of predicting the performance of a portfolio, it's reliant on these external, by design, rare events that cause the big losses.
Well, and it's a super logical conclusion to draw, right? Which is that if I can just track all of the relationships between underwriting criteria and claims outcomes, then I'm going to find some stuff that's predictive. And there are some really good examples that have worked across periods of hundreds of years in motor insurance, for example. There's so much data around that you can start to pick out what's predictive to the point where it actually starts to become discriminatory and illegal to use certain factors in pricing. And that's kind of an established methodology that they've used. So it's a natural conclusion to just extend that and say, well, that could apply to any line of business. The problem comes in practicality. A lot of companies that we talk to, they struggle to get underwriting information and claims information and put that in the same place. They struggle to get a list of declarations under a particular binder and put that together with the information on the binder itself, because everything is stored in different systems. Historically, software and data management tools have been so siloed that actually even getting to the first stage of being able to make these predictive calculations is nigh on impossible, because software it works in such a small, isolated part of that business, and there isn't any kind of software that sits between departments or between partners or kind of fills those gaps and allows you to look across different data sets.
Yeah. Well, you certainly have that technology challenge there, right? Like, our industry conflates its ambitions to those of like technology companies. If like Google can do these things or like Meta can do these things, like we should be able to also. But those are fundamentally technology companies who at their core, like 90% of their staff is like software developers, which is a different structure of talent, let's say, than what you get in insurance. But you're right, when you get into like how it's actually set up, the real problems are that they're capturing lots and lots of data, but because of that, you're struggling with like relatively simple, what would be perceived to be simple sort of outputs. When you look at the reinsurance layer, it always interests me because there's still value that the reinsurers get from more data, especially related to property events or bordereau data that they helps them evaluate a portfolio. But at the end of the day, the biggest driver of reinsurance, like pricing, is going to be the performance of that cedent, right? If that cedent is showing consistent, if the cedent is using data and more information to help price risk in real time or reduce the cost of claims and all these types of things, that's really powerful for the insurance company. But when they go to buy the reinsurance, like the aggregate results and things are kind of what matters, right? Can they tell that story? Can they prove that this is an effective way for them to write their book? But if they're saying it is for all these reasons, but the performance actually isn't showing it's effective, that's what the reinsurers are going to care about maybe more than anything else.
And again, there's silos and disconnects when it comes to that, right? Probably the biggest success story in terms of technology in reinsurance to date in the industry has been the advent and growth of cat modeling. Mm-hmm. Some of the cat models incredibly sophisticated, lots of argument over how accurate they really are and what we can infer from some of the predictions, particularly when big events do happen. But the technology is incredibly sophisticated, it's incredibly well adopted, and it's become incredibly standardized. However, if you go into some cat modeling software and look at any input or any output from cat modeling software, how much premium data is in that?
It's a lot less than you'd expect there to be.
Zero.
Yeah.
Zero. It's all about exposure information, right? It's exposure management, and they're looking at what the exposure is. Yeah. But they don't even put premium information into that.
Yeah.
And a reinsurer is supposed to decide what the performance of this portfolio is without having the premium information attached to it. So this is where I mean, like, actually the full information that a reinsurer needs to price is in several different locations because of the adoption of a certain type of technology. And it's actually made the world more complicated rather than less, which is what it should have done.
Well, yeah, because when you think about that exposure management piece, you're right. When you think about what the outcomes of cat model software is like, well, what's the 1 in 500, 1 in 100, 1 in 1,000 year event curve, and making sure I'm buying enough reinsurance so that it's more of an indication of how much coverage needs to exist or how high does this tower need to go. That's a different question.
And
it's an important
those
thing.
modeling companies don't care how much you charged for that exposure.
Yep.
But I bet you most reinsurers do.
Yeah. And that's the big thing. So it's two different questions, both important questions. But one is the height of this tower sufficient? And that's maybe more of a question for the insurance company in a lot of ways, because the reinsurer doesn't really care if it goes out the top and you're just taking the rest of it. Like, it's bad on you as the cedent, but the reinsurer is not on the hook anymore for most products, right? If you talk about a traditional reinsurance XL tower or something. But yeah, you're right. If you say all this exposure was written for pennies on the dollar, the reinsurer would really want to know that, and it's not included in property cat pricing as much as people might expect it to be.
Well, because that's the other thing, isn't it? Is that people often talk about rate online as the indicator, or pricing being based on the exposure that you have for reinsurance. However, once the contract wording is out there, most of that pricing is done on a premium basis.
Yeah. So the question is, I think, where does the industry go from here? As we get more and more of this data coming in and more sources of data, and it's easier than ever to supplement data that you have with other sources of data that you are licensing or buying, how are companies looking maybe to leverage that data more effectively? How might that transform how reinsurance gets priced? What are you sort of seeing in that sort of forward-looking view?
So there's two elements to it. I think the first is a move towards standardization. And I think what we see over time is certainly an increased understanding that standardization of data generally for certain tasks is required. What does the perfect reinsurance submission look like? Well, it's telling a story and it's a narrative, and it needs to be very flexible, but the underlying information, there's kind of a minimum amount of information that needs to be in there. Yeah. And it's really important that the industry starts to define much better what that minimum standard is and what the expectation is on cedents when they go to deliver that, and the assumptions that they make. I think the second is that as more and more different data sources get merged together in, really cool industry-wide technology platforms such as Supercede, to give a mandatory plug, then the transparency around what's been done to that information is going to start to become massively important.
Yeah.
So it's not just about standardizing the information that's available. It's about making any kind of data manipulation really, really transparent, so that I can see how information has been derived, how different data sets have been put together, and I can build a level of confidence around that data that I'm receiving.
Yeah, I also think, and the industry's been making slow but steady progress in this space for a while, but this recognition that there's collaboration around the data. How do we get it from the carrier to their brokers and then to the reinsurers in a way that those parties can more quickly evaluate what that information is telling them? Brokers, we're seeing this more and more, being able to more effectively evaluate how several different structures might perform based on that data from a client. Like if you send them a variety of data in all different formats every single time, their ability to do that level of work and analysis is sort of capped. And the same thing with the reinsurers. Like the reinsurer's role, yes, certainly to help determine like a viable price for that risk, 100%. But reinsurers also play a massive role in providing alternative structure options that might be more cost effective to cedents and all these types of things. And the better we get as an industry of saying, here is a data standard that you can have, like all my submission data in the way that you're expecting to see it, the more effective every party in that chain gets at doing the work for the net benefit of everybody else in that same chain. So that's a huge step.
We're not going to move away from automated pricing.
Yeah.
Right. Pricing is not going to become more manual. I think we've seen like the rapid adoption of SaaS or web-based pricing platforms, and that's just going to continue, right? If you can't put standardized and transparent data into those platforms, then they're just not going to perform at the efficiency that they need to.
Yeah. Well, and you've seen a bit of this happening with the CAT models, right? Where assumptions that the brokers make on that are now being more transparent, where it's like, oh, okay, at least now as a reinsurer, I'm able to go, do I agree or disagree with that assumption? There's a willingness to do that. But if you don't have that transparency, all you're doing is seeding the doubt into that conversation of like, I know you've done some manipulation here. Like you're not making it very clear as to what that was. And this is where things like price loading comes in. You're like,
they're not going to come
hedging.
back and ask questions to
Yeah.
you. They're just going to assume the worst case
Yeah.
and give you a price based on that.
Yeah. Yeah. But if you have that transparency, like they can do a couple things. They can evaluate whether they believe in that. They can load accordingly if they think it's a wrong assumption, or they could undo that assumption and run it based on how they see it and kind of get a sense as to what the middle might look like. Right? All of these things will work towards the net benefit of the effectiveness of all parties involved. And if that works,
there's one really common criticism that we get. I know you've heard it before, but when we talk about Supercede again, and this isn't a plug, this is just experience. But when we talk about how the platform works and why it works, and we talk about the penalty of bad data and the kind of tax that people pay for having bad data, one of the criticisms that we always get is, well, what if when I clean the data up and when the data is 100% accurate, it actually says I represent a worse risk than I previously told you? Like, what happens then? I don't know. I know for a fact you've heard this before. So I'd be curious, like, what your stock response is.
Yeah, it's from everything we've ever heard from underwriters is that's an impossibility, right? And they say it so stone-faced of like false, like they say it in a way. There was as a side story, there was a tech thing conversations a few years ago now where someone was like talking to like a senior engineer at Meta or Facebook at the time. And he's like, "Oh, are you guys listening? Are you listening to our phones and stealing and using the audio to like know everything about us?" And he just looked the person dead in the eye and goes, "We don't need to." And that was actually a scarier response because it meant the volume of data that they had meant like what you are saying is like inferior data than from the amount that we have. But it reminds you of that because it's a similar response. It's like we wouldn't price more. Like it's so brief and like abrupt. It's like, oh, you're charging so much more when you don't trust it that like it could be 4 times worse, 5 times worse, and you'd still come out better. But it's like the bluntness of that, like it wouldn't be higher, is like startling. But I think it's a natural response and a natural like concern of like, but what if they see something they don't like? And it's like we're social animals, right? Like we have that with all areas of our life. Like, what if my partner doesn't know? Like,
we want to be liked,
and we want to be liked, so we try so hard to like present the best version of ourselves in all the ways. But like, everyone knows that everyone's trying their best to be the best version of themselves all the time. But there's this real concern of like ruthless pushback or counterbalance or reactionary change if something were to come to light. But it's not how this works.
So it's pretty blunt, right? The level of loading for bad data, according to pricing actuaries, is so high that even if your data told a worse story, you would still likely pay less, right? That's quite anecdotal on that side. The other side is if it was so dramatically different that for some reason you were the outlier and it was something that was going to be more expensive than just your normal price loading for bad data, the reinsurance that you're buying is next to worthless.
Yeah.
Anyway, right? Because suddenly losses are going to come in that you weren't expecting, or losses are going to come in on business that nobody thought you wrote. And the impact of that on your business is going to be worse.
Yep.
Than what exists at the moment.
One of the other interesting threads here that doesn't seem to get considered given how much the industry values it is the role of these as relationships. If you have as a cedent have like a horrendous loss year and the reinsurers 90% of the time or more will still come back next year and come to bat with you and probably increase your prices far less than they might deserve to be increased because they see it as a long-term partnership with those firms. if you came one year with like fundamentally different or worse data, but we're like telling the reinsurers like, we're making these changes, we're pulling the Band-Aid off, we're correcting these things, and this is better data, and here's why, I guarantee the reinsurers would see that as a sign of partnership and would be willing to be like, great, like it's worse than we thought it was going to be, worse than it had been from what you'd reported previously. But they're not going to like pull the plug on that relationship. Like, it's a relationship-driven business at its core, and they've trusted you on your word for decades. So the idea would be like, well, I've got this bad news. Like, they're not just going to walk from that relationship.
We've seen it happen. We've obviously no names will be named, but we've seen customers of ours that have realised that on certain lines of business, the data that they were submitting to reinsurers was so bad and dramatically different. Actually, they ended up launching like a 2 or 3 year project to more gradually implement the changes that a system like Supercede can provide to kind of soften the blow of that communication, because they didn't have that confidence that the reinsurers were going to stand by them after you've basically gone up and said, yeah, we've been feeding you porkies for a few years.
Yeah. But I think people are more wary of that than they necessarily need to be. I can see why they believe that to be true, but I think it'd be...
it's not up to us how they manage that.
No.
Right? But I think there's a variety of different ways that it is managed.
But I would serve a reminder that, like, remember how deep these relationships go, right? This is not like, they want to be like, oh, great, we're working on this thing together now. Let's be better partners. I bet you get access to increased capacity as part of that, like, as you sort of said, like, if this is going to be a journey to improve how we do this, I guarantee the sort of lead underwriters on those things would be like willing to go bigger on that journey with you and like use that as a window to deepen a relationship. And I think you're seeing more cedents do that. We also have clients who are sort of taking that approach, right? And that's, I think the fact we've seen some more of our clients doing that recently is what's giving me like optimism that that's going to be the way this shift happens.
We've had underwriters, want to delve into the platform and understand how different elements of it work. Yeah. And I think that goes to their kind of eagerness to understand more about the data and to understand what more transparent means or what better data means that we keep banging on about.
Yeah. So, I mean, if we sort of circle back on the conversation or on this topic, like, how will the industry evolve with this sort of like deluge of data that comes through? It'll come through ways to standardize it, ways to easily manage it and share it with parties and build standards around it. So, like, it's a central theme, and it's one that we obviously care about a lot, and something we're seeing sort of a lot of optimistic sort of movements towards. So it's gonna be a fun few years for the industry, I think.
So a bright future. I like ending on an upbeat note.
Yeah, see? Well, on that chipper note, see you next time, everybody.
Thanks for tuning in to the Reinsurance Podcast. If you enjoyed our show, don't forget to subscribe wherever you get your podcasts and leave us a review to let us know how we're doing, preferably 5 stars. For more insights and updates, follow us on LinkedIn and visit our website at supercede.com/podcasts. You'll find the links in the show notes.